The concept of nuclear-powered commercial ships has moved on from a distinctly left-field idea to a serious possibility over the last few years, as shipping seeks to decarbonise. There is no doubt that nuclear power offers the zero carbon emissions which the industry seeks, but it still faces many hurdles, not least regulatory and public perception. Hi, this is Marcus Hand, editor of Seatrade Maritime News. One of the companies at the forefront of new nuclear in shipping has been Core Power, and today you'll be hearing from CEO Mikal Boe. Mikal, welcome back to the Seatrade Maritime Podcast.
It's very nice to be here, Marcus.
Thank you, Mikal. Thanks for your time. Perhaps you could just briefly introduce yourself to our listeners and Core Power.
Yeah, I'm Mikal Boe. I founded Core Power back in 2018 as a way to try to figure out how we could fill that gap between what happens when we have to decarbonize the shipping industry while still maintaining competitive economically, not having to create solutions that would effectively bankrupt the industry. We're trying to keep energy efficiency moving forward. I'd spent close to 25 years in the shipping industry prior to that. I feel like I speak shipping quite fluently. And over the last 6, 7 years, I've learned to speak nuclear as well. So we're sort of part of our job is to translate that communication between shipping that doesn't really understand nuclear particularly well yet, but starting to, and nuclear that doesn't understand shipping particularly well, but is starting to. So that's really what we do. We're also developing new nuclear technologies together with partners in the United States that are suitable for the marine environment. The sort of new technologies, new reactor technologies, new nuclear technologies that can actually be used in the commercial market. Very distinctly different from what's being used in nuclear navies, for example.
So a lot going on there, and it's been 3 years since you were last a guest on the podcast. What do you see as the biggest single landmark event for Core Power in that time?
Well, Marcus, there's been a lot of things happening, a lot of milestones, on the product development side, the market development side, customer development side, and of course, in bringing the community together around this to really understand what might come of a new nuclear and maritime future. I think the largest and the biggest milestone over the last 3 years, and goodness, how time flies. I can't believe it's been 3 years since the last time, has been, if you like, the insertion of nuclear into the agenda at the IMO. It's not quite there yet, but it is working its way through the system, and we believe in 2025 become part of the work stream at the IMO. And similarly, at the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, we've now got maritime firmly on the agenda. So that aligns the two big standards organizations, if you like, for maritime and nuclear around this topic of putting this at sea in a safe way. And that's remarkable because it starts to force both nuclear and maritime regulators in those countries that have competent authorities in both areas. It starts to force those into a relationship where they have to work together. That's not really something that happens a lot these days. The maritime coast guard, the regulators, etc., don't really speak to the nuclear regulator much, but there's now if you like, an international community mechanism to force that to start happening. That sets the foundation for the next part of the roadmap towards commercialization of this, which is the insurability, the commercial insurability of nuclear vessels, allowing them to come into ports, navigate in waterways, etc. I think that's probably the most remarkable thing that we've seen. It's international community realizing that we've got to solve both the decarbonization issue and the economic sort of energy efficiency issue around this industry. That's been remarkable.
I can see why you see that as a very significant move forward, because I think the regulatory piece is something we all look at when we talk about nuclear. I think, well, that's got to be core to getting this up and running in a meaningful way. Now, as I said, it's actually over 3 years since we last talked. I was really amazed when I found that out. And the idea of nuclear power for maritime has become a lot more prominent. How is that translating to sort of real concrete action?
Well, when I first started this, I think we might have spoken about this 3 years ago, Marcus. When I first started this, there was a very, very small group of people that thought it was a good idea to start down this road. And that's changed remarkably. I mean, if you go to any conference in our shipping industry, if you go to a nuclear conference, you'll have maritime on the agenda. Floating nuclear powered vessels is something that's on the agenda at nuclear conferences, remarkably enough. At shipping conferences, this is a topic that's brought up in most of those conferences, often there are panels, keynote speakers that come and talk about this. There is also a effect of a long-term communication to the market about the logic of this, right? It's not just, look, it's a good idea, let's try and figure out how to do it, but the logic of, what type of technologies are required to meet the criteria that allows us to do this in a way that's commercial, that's safe, that's secure, that's efficient, etc., etc. It's not just putting nuclear at sea. It's a very specific set of criteria that need to be met. And we've spent a lot of time over these last 3 years, well, actually longer than that, of course, but the last 3 years since I last spoke with you, Marcus, we spent a lot of time, engaging with individual owners, operators, banks, insurance companies, regulators, governments, NGOs, with financiers, with the whole ecosystem, not just on the shipping side of this, but on the energy side and on the nuclear side as well. And being able to communicate that essential logic, I think, creates an interest in the topic. It's not about trying to convince people that this is a good idea or it's safe or somebody else should be doing it. It's about sparking an interest. And nuclear is it's interesting. It's a very interesting topic. I think most people like to learn something about it. And that little knowledge has gone an awful long way. Right? If you know something about it, you start to understand it, you realize it's not quite as complex as it might sound. And we've just got the world paying attention. That's something I'm very pleased about.
How is that translated, say, into interest from, like, specifically from shipping companies, for example?
Well, at the moment, we've got a shareholder base in Corpower. So Corpower is funded by investors from the shipping maritime industry. So all this ecosystem around ship owning, ship operating, ship building, etc. And that's being expanded now into the energy sector and others. But the shareholders that we have at the moment control, operate, manage over 5,000 ships. So, there's a big chunk of the fleet out there, or representing a big chunk of the fleet out there, that's looking to this technology. The central deal is, you invest early so that you can get the technology first, or have an option to get the technology first. That's quite unique. There aren't many industries around nuclear where the customers, the future customers, are prepared to stand up and say, okay, we'll invest in this now because we believe that the track you're on is one that's the right one. Are you going in the right direction? And when you get there, once that technology is out, we can insure it, we can install it, we can operate it, it's acceptable to the market and it functions well, then we have the option to take it first. And that's a good trade with the market, we think.
No, I can certainly see that. You also recently had the announcement with the project with LR and Maersk, which I think attracted quite a bit of attention.
That's right. It's nice. It's nice when, the big household names, are prepared to stand up and say, yeah, we're in. We want to be part of this. We want to work on this. We're not just going to do this in the background, we're going to do it publicly. And I think that's wonderful. Behind the scenes, of course, there's a lot of these large projects with, household names that are even more household than the ones that were announced last week. But, it's being kept quietly in the background for various reasons. So it's nice that we can get the kind of commitments from Lloyd's, from Maersk, from the other parties in that project to stand up and be counted, if you like. I think that's nice.
Yeah, I'm sure it sort of lends credibility to be able to have those sort of names and, and speak about it publicly.
Well, it sort of makes it mainstream, right? I mean, it's something that people look at and go, oh, okay, if they're doing it, maybe we should be doing it, and that kind of helps.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. Now, you've been working on a test reactor project in the US. How is that going?
Well, this is our molten chloride reactor experiment, which is the safety case, if you like, for the molten chloride fast reactor, which is that molten salt reactor that meets all the criteria, if you like, for the maritime industry. It's the sort of ultimate marine reactor once it's there. The molten chloride reactor experiment, CRE as we call it, it's being built at Idaho National Laboratory in the United States with help from the US Department of Energy. It is a first of a kind, so it'll be the very first time that one of these machines will have operated. It's small, it's an experiment, it's there to put the parameters around the absolute safety case of that technology. It's moving forward decisively. You can only imagine the complexity of building something like this and validating every single part and how everything's going to work, and then installing it in a complex building at a national laboratory in the United States. It's sometimes feels like painfully slow progress, but in fact it's moving meaningfully forward all the time. So we don't have much to report from that, in no more than that it's being built, it's coming together, and we believe that it's going to be quite a milestone by the time that's up and running. But it's not significant in itself because it's not the machine. It's the small machine that provides the vital, specific, first-hand data that's required to populate the tables that we need to give to the nuclear regulators for the licensing of a machine. You can emulate these things with expensive and difficult software, but actually you need real data, real experience from having, pumped fuel salt into a reactor, bring it up to criticality, control it up and down, do various tests, turn it off, switch the fuel salt back out of the machine, and then that's the experiment. So that data goes into the licensing case. That licensing case can then, or that licensing process can then start. So there's it's part of the longer term process.
Okay, so it's going to be quite ongoing. Not going to be expecting any significant announcements immediately.
No, I mean, there'll be announcements around it, but there won't be a sort of final look. Here it is. It worked. Now we're shutting the program down, kind of thing. It'll carry on for an awful long time, I think, and there's much more to be done with that than the initial tests as well.
Right. Now, I think you also made an announcement some time back about partnering with one of the major Korean yards as well. What's happening with that?
The very back end of last year, Hyundai Heavy Industries, and that's HDK SOE, the largest shipbuilder in the world, joined the program with TerraPower, Southern Company, Core Power, to build this molten chloride fast reactor, this molten salt reactor that I referred to earlier. So they are a extremely welcome addition to the team, if you like. I mean, being the world's largest shipbuilder and capabilities in manufacturing that we're all envious of. So it's been a wonderful addition to have them in there. For us in particular, it's meaningful that we've got now a second partner that's fully aligned with ourselves on the maritime side. You have to appreciate that Southern Company is an electric utility and is looking at this from a sort of power production point of view, potentially on land mostly. We want to do this in the marine environment. So now Hyundai joining in and being one of those marine partners in the program, adds credence and weight to the case for designing this for a marine environment, which is kind of where we've been pushing for this to go, and I think also where things are going now. And they're a wonderful bunch to work with. I mean, we really appreciate that, and I think they're fully aligned with our interests, with our shareholders and with our stakeholders from the maritime industry. I mean, I think they just add so much to that. So, we're very, very pleased with that.
Now, as we kind of look forward to where we're going with this, are we really looking at nuclear powered ships with MSRs on board, or are we looking at floating production of green fuels, which using that technology, or is it a combination of both?
Well, it's always hard to give a precise answer about that, Marcus, because there's so many different things that play into it, right? I mean, predicting the future is, or predicting anything is difficult, in particular the future, right? So I think what we're going to see is both. If you're going to have a meaningful production of synthetic fuels that replace fuel oil for diesel engines or combustion engines, you're going to have a nuclear component to do that, because you're going to need electrolysis of water to create the hydrogen that is the sort of the essential feedstock of those fuels. And there's no other economic way of doing that with nuclear. So you're going to need to have dedicated nuclear facilities that do that. That could be floating nuclear refineries, if you like, that can create, ammonia, methanol, synthetic aviation fuel, whatever it might be that there is demand for. But that requires an actual demand for those products, right? And there's no one's going to stand up a refinery to make meaningful amounts of green ammonia for shipping without demand actually being there. Demand signals we're seeing from dual fuel vessels and industry wanting to sort of show that it's meaningfully trying to move away from fossil fuels, but that demand signal is to be there because there's a big investment to build those refineries. I think we can see floating nuclear power for all sorts of applications. I mean, one of them is ports. I mean, ports are going to have to provide electricity for vessels to cold iron whilst they're in the port. And where's that going to come from? In a lot of ports, that's a massive challenge. So putting a small floating nuclear power plant into that port that sits on a jetty and powers that port and provides that green energy, on a reliable basis is, a good solution for some ports and many ports, I think. I think we can see many applications of floating nuclear power being placed in areas where the fossil fuel supply chain or energy supply chain is difficult. You talk about islands, you talk about remote areas, talking about coastal industries and infrastructure, including ports. It's sort of, I wouldn't call it a low-hanging fruit, but it's one that meets a very clear demand very quickly and is very efficient at providing that clean power to this area, especially since they've been mandated to decarbonize themselves. I think when it comes to nuclear powered vessels, this is where there's a lot of diversity of opinion about what may or may not happen. There's no real reason why this can't happen almost concurrently to the launch of floating nuclear power or just after. There are two big issues that need to be resolved in order to have that happen, because if you're going to launch floating nuclear power solutions in coastal areas, say United States, EU, Scandinavia, Mediterranean, other parts of the world, South Korea, Japan, of course, um, that's something that can be done domestically. You could do that under national regulations. You can do that with national insurance. With domestic insurance. You could do it with the permitting and approval of local authorities. But if you're going to transit that from one country to another, you're constantly moving across these sort of four specific regulatory regimes that you're passing from, out of a port across the open ocean into another port. You're going to have a commercial insurance for that vessel, not for the vessel, just for the vessel, but for the nuclear insurance that covers any liability around the energy systems on there. And that's something that needs to be resolved partly with standards from the maritime side, partly with standards from the nuclear side, the licensing from the nuclear side, the classification on the maritime side, the formation of a regime of type approval of the interface, the boundary condition between what's nuclear and what's marine on that vessel, and then a harmonization of the P&I structure on the maritime side and nuclear risk structure on the other side. So, it's a fairly complex picture I'm painting for you. But, that work is in progress. It'll happen. It'll take some time. But once that's there is very little impediment to starting launching of these vessels on specific trade routes to start with. I mean, you're not going to build 1,000 vessels to start with. It'll be one, then two, then five, then 10, etc. So, and we think that this is something that comes, and that kind of show and tell, that ability to show how these vessels can be 100% clean, they can be faster, they can carry more cargo, they can power the ports both ends of a voyage. There's an awful lot of things that can come from it. I think that's where this really gets going. We've got to actually show how that's going to work. And I don't see any reason why that shouldn't happen pretty soon after we've got this all in place.
Yeah, there are quite a lot of elements to that you've just described. I mean, is there a sort of potential time frame for when we might have the first ship going between two ports, as you described?
Yeah, there is. We're working to a timeline that sits somewhere after 2032 for that. And the reason for this is the product development programs around these Generation 4 reactors, especially the ones that we're working for, is effectively a 20-year program, right? And it started in 2013, sort of 18 to 20 years further. We're in sort of 2031, 2033. Then, that includes the licensing case, includes the permitting case, some demonstration of the viability of safety critical systems, as well as the installation and the permitting of that installation then on a floating platform. To get that moving as a ship is something that flows from that. So if by the early 30s the first machines start to come out, they start to be shown to work in a floating environment, all the permits and all the various things that come around that, I see this happening in a few years after that. So it's not something that I think will be delayed much further than somewhere between 2030 and 35, I'd say. I think we've got another 10 years. And that's probably ahead of some of these hydrogen stories that are out there.
Yeah, there's various different timelines for lots of different technologies. It's good to get a feel for what it would potentially be like for nuclear. I think one of the things that when you talk about nuclear is public perception of nuclear power. And is the population at large ready to accept nuclear-powered shipping, the idea that a nuclear-powered ship might be calling at a port near where they live?
It's a good question, Mark, 'cause I don't actually know well, actually, I don't think I know the answer to that question in particular. What we're seeing, however, is we're seeing a very decisive shift in public opinion around nuclear in general, right? Not necessarily for ships or in floating environment, or whether it's a small or medium-sized large reactor, whether it's doing this or that, the other. I mean, that's sort of the nuances that can come a little bit later on. But we're seeing a decisive shift, not just in the United Kingdom, but in the United States, across the EU, even in Germany. I mean, there was a survey that came out in one of the big German newspapers last week that showed that 62% of the German populations were now pro-nuclear. Now, can't remember what the exact number was 5, 6 years ago, but it was small, right? You see these substantial changes as activists are out there, as information is made available, as people are talking about it, getting interested in it, wondering why wind and solar isn't doing what those who promoted it said it was going to do. And this realization that, renewables, which has been the solar and wind I'm talking about in particular, sort of weather dependent energy systems, has been the choice, if you like, for decarbonization for so long. And the realization that this is actually a really cheap way to make energy expensive, right? And this parallel realization that, yes, nuclear is expensive and it needs to meet very high standards, but it's an expensive way to make energy cheap. So you have this dichotomy that's starting to really shift people's attention into, okay, if we buy quality and we buy quality for the longer term, then we're better off in the longer term because the cost of maintaining and running that energy system is lower as we go into the future, as opposed to some quick fix that just makes everything more expensive. And that is the economic case that I think people are looking at and thinking, actually, we've kind of got to do this. How do we do this? What's the right way to do this? And that's happening in shipping as well. We're starting to see ship owners, ship operators, investors, banks, etc., going, okay, so, right, how is this actually going to work? How are we going to use all of these technologies out there to make a meaningful impact, not just on the environmental greenhouse gas impact of the industry, but on the economic side of this? How are we going to improve energy efficiency, keep competitive, and keep moving forward? And it doesn't take an awful lot of discussion before people realize that sort of nuclear is an essential part of it. There's no net zero without nuclear. And as a result, you spark the interest. People start coming to the table, learning a little bit about it, starting to get interested, start talking about it, and then it comes out there. So public opinion shifts. It shifts decisively over time. I think we're about halfway through a decade-long shift from anti to pro. And by the time we get to where we want to be, Marcus, I suspect there's going to be plenty of support for this.
And that's interesting to hear about that shift and what we were talking about in Germany, which in particular I think a lot of us would see as a country that was quite anti-nuclear. It was
Power of the press,
indeed. You touched on there's a whole lot of things you touched on there, on things on finance and whatever. And we could talk about those, and it would, that would be like an entire another episode. So I'm going to leave those for now and just sort of wrap this up. As I said at the start, it was just over 3 years ago you were last on the podcast. If we come back and do another episode in 3 years' time, and by the way, I don't mean I'm not going to talk to you for 3 years in between, Mikal, but where would you expect to be in 3 years' time?
Well, we expect to be moving forward. This is a sleeves folded up, eyes wide open enterprise, and the most sort of absolute key tenets here is that we learn something all the time. We never pretend that we have all the answers, because that would be foolish. We recognize that the more we learn, the more there is to learn. So building out our organization and making sure that we have a program that's there to meet the demands that are placed on us to deliver this system and this program, not just from a product point of view, but also the market, regulations, rules, standards, permits, licenses, finance. It's just an ongoing process that continues to evolve. So in 3 years, where we expect to be, Marcus, realistically, is we expect to be much further ahead in the track that we're on at the moment. And at that point, the milestones are things that you're looking for me to reveal, I would say, are that we have a fairly well developed collaborative effort between the nuclear regulators and the maritime regulators in those countries that have competent authorities in both. That's predominantly in the OECD. So that's the IMO and the IAEA, the insurance industry, the work on a civil liability convention that covers the insurers as ships move around. I expect to have moved forward quite substantially. I think our technologies are going to be in the position where we're showing actual machine designs and how they will fit in, etc. So there's going to be a lot of a lot closer confluence, if you like, between product, market, and then the formation of that order book, that conditional formation of the order book of the initial floating nuclear power plants, initial nuclear ships, that then we, I think, really need to establish to move decisively forward with the manufacturability of the system. So that's where we expect to be sort of around 27, 28. Also think there is a lot of money pouring into these things. I expect that our financing capabilities are going to be quite a lot stronger. I mean, it's strong as it is right now, but it's going to be stronger even by the time we get into the next 3 years. I expect there's a lot of pent-up demand for investment in the sector.
Great. Well, it sounds like we'll be looking out for more announcements for Core Power in the coming months and years. I'd just like to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk to our listeners, Mikal.
It's always a pleasure, Marcus. Thanks for having me on.